telling you to walk away. Just walk away, okay? Walk away.
Number 1. Juan David Ortiz. A woman appeared at a gas station, visibly distressed and seeking help. A Texas state trooper nearby rushed to assist her. Through fear and exhaustion, she managed to say that someone was trying to harm her, a claim that would uncover one of the most alarming betrayals of trust in U.S. Border Patrol history. The man she named was Juan David Ortiz. In 2018, Ortiz was a 9-year veteran of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, working as an intelligence supervisor in Laredo, Texas. He was a former Navy medic, held a master's degree, and was seen as a devoted family man. To colleagues, he was disciplined and respected the last person anyone would suspect. Everything began on September 3rd, when 29-year-old Melissa Ramirez was reported missing. She had accepted a ride from Ortiz, whom she knew. Her body was later found in a remote area outside the city. Investigators were still searching for answers when Ortiz returned to work as if nothing had happened. Days later, another woman, 42-year-old Claudine Luera, also disappeared after speaking with Ortiz. She was later found critically injured and did not survive. The pattern was becoming clear. Vulnerable women in a known area of Laredo were being targeted, and the community grew increasingly fearful. On September 14th, Ortiz picked up a woman named Erica Peña. During their drive, his behavior changed. He mentioned Ramirez's death and hinted that authorities might question him. When they stopped at a convenience store, Peña sensed danger, escaped the vehicle, and ran toward a state trooper for help. Her report immediately triggered a large-scale law enforcement response. Officers arrived at Ortiz's home, but he was gone. In the short time before his arrest, 2 more women, 35-year-old Giselda Cantu and 28-year-old Janelle Ortiz, lost their lives. Police located Ortiz at a gas station near a hotel the next morning. He attempted to flee but was taken into custody shortly. Afterward, during questioning, Ortiz at first denied involvement. Eventually, he gave a recorded statement to authorities, calmly explaining his actions and claiming he wanted to clean up the streets. Investigators described his demeanor as emotionless. His defense team later argued that mental health issues from military service and medication side effects impaired his judgment, but the court rejected these claims. In December 2022, after a lengthy trial, a jury found Ortiz guilty on all charges. He received a sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole. His appeal was denied, and he remains incarcerated in a Texas state facility. The families of the victims Melissa Ramirez, Claudine Luera, Giselda Cantu, and Janelle Ortiz continue to seek healing after a tragedy caused by someone sworn to protect the public. And this case was only the beginning. Next, we look at an immigration officer whose abuse of power inside detention facilities stunned the nation. Number 2. Andrew Golobic.
Former ICE officer Andrew Golobic is charged with sex trafficking for allegedly raping 2 undocumented Mexican women.
The immigration databases were supposed to track people seeking asylum, monitor their court appearances, ensure compliance with federal regulations. For Andrew Golobic, they served a different purpose entirely. Federal prosecutors would later describe them as his hunting grounds for victims. Behind the professional facade of an ICE deportation officer sat a predator who had spent years weaponizing his authority against the most vulnerable women in the American immigration system. Golobic joined U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in 2006, building what appeared to be a respectable 14-year career with the agency. By 2015, he'd been assigned to the Alternatives to Detention program at the Blue Ash, Ohio office, just north of Cincinnati. The ATD initiative represented a more humane approach to immigration enforcement, allowing certain asylum seekers and low-risk individuals to remain in their communities while their cases moved through the legal system. Instead of detention facilities, participants lived normal lives but reported regularly to supervising officers. Golobic was one of those officers. He held immense discretion over the women assigned to him, deciding how often they reported, what type of monitoring they received, how much freedom they were permitted. Most significantly, he could recommend immediate detention or deportation for anyone who violated program conditions. That power became his weapon. From March 2017 through June 2020, Golobic systematically exploited his position. The investigation would eventually uncover at least half a dozen women directly under his supervision who engaged in intimate acts at his residence, along with several others he harassed inside ICE offices. One victim, a young woman from Honduras who had survived a brutal attack in her homeland, testified about the night everything changed. She believed they were on their third date when Golobic invited her to his home for dinner. Once inside, he led her to his bedroom. She described shaking with fear as he undressed her. During the encounter, when she protested the way he was hurting her, he ignored her completely. Another woman's ordeal centered on something as simple as a passport. The ATD program required participants to check in using a smartphone application. When hers malfunctioned, Golobic instructed her to contact him directly on his personal device instead. Later, when she needed her passport returned, Golobic refused to provide it through proper channels. He told her to come to his residence if she wanted it back. When she arrived, he made his terms explicit. The passport was hers only after she complied with his demands. Afterward, she repeatedly rejected his continued advances, but Golobic made comments that convinced her he would retaliate against her undocumented relatives and friends. Fearing deportation not just for herself, but for everyone she cared about, she returned to his home. The pattern repeated itself. What made Golobic's actions particularly insidious was his position within the very system investigating such crimes. When the FBI and Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General approached him in June 2020 as part of their inquiry, Golobic immediately began destroying evidence. He deleted applications and conversations from his cell phones, searched online for instructions on how to erase digital traces, and directed at least one woman to delete our texts because he feared getting caught. During the investigation, he even tampered with witnesses, using veiled threats, misleading statements, and corrupt persuasion to convince victims to protect him instead of themselves. His arrest came in December 2022. A federal grand jury handed down a 7-count indictment charging him with offenses, including deprivation of civil rights while acting under color of law, obstruction of a federal investigation, witness tampering, and destruction of records. The most serious charge was attempting to traffic someone by exchanging something of value, her passport, for intimate acts. Prosecutors made clear the stakes. If convicted on all counts, Golobic faced a potential maximum penalty of life imprisonment. His trial commenced January 2024 before Senior U.S. District Judge Michael R. Barrett. Golobic took the stand in his own defense, insisting everything had been consensual. He portrayed himself as someone who joked frequently, claiming his message about exchanging a passport for intimacy was merely his sense of humor. He testified about having relationships with 5 or 6 women in the ATD program, acknowledging it was unethical but denying he ever forced anyone or destroyed evidence. Yet he also admitted deleting applications and conversations after learning about the FBI investigation, and conceded he'd purchased gifts for some women. He supervised furniture, vehicle repairs, designer bags. Throughout his testimony, Golobic frequently interrupted both prosecutors and his own attorneys, occasionally chuckled when describing his encounters, and repeatedly had to be instructed by the judge to wait for questions to finish before answering. After 4 full days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on January 26th. Golobic was found guilty on 4 of 7 counts, obstructing an investigation into trafficking, depriving a Honduran survivor of her fundamental right to bodily integrity under color of law, witness tampering, and destruction of records. The jury could not reach unanimous agreement on the trafficking charge itself, resulting in a mistrial on that specific count. He was acquitted regarding the second victim. On March 11, 2025, Andrew Golobic appeared before Judge Barrett for sentencing. "What I did was unethical," he told the court, "but I would never, ever hurt anybody." The judge disagreed. Golobic received 144 months, 12 years in federal prison, U.S. Marshals escorted him back to the Campbell County Detention Center, where he'd been held since his arrest. Federal authorities continue encouraging anyone with information about additional victims to come forward. The investigation revealed a man who transformed a program designed to offer dignity and second chances into his personal domain of exploitation. Andrew Golobic's abuse represents only one pattern of corruption within immigration enforcement. Our next case reveals how even deeper within the system, a special agent took payments from the very cartels he was supposed to be fighting. Number 3. Felix Cisneros Jr. The private jet touched down smoothly, another luxury courtesy of someone federal investigators would only identify as Individual 1. Felix Cisneros Jr. stepped off the aircraft and into a waiting car that would deliver him to yet another 5-star hotel. For an agent with Homeland Security Investigations earning a government salary, such extravagance should have raised immediate questions. But Cisneros had learned to rationalize these gifts, these cash payments, these lavish experiences. He told himself he deserved them. What he refused to acknowledge was the price tag attached to every indulgence, his integrity, his oath, and eventually his freedom. Cisneros worked as a special agent with HSI, the investigative arm of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. His responsibilities included combating transnational crime, human trafficking, and organized criminal enterprises attempting to exploit American borders. He possessed extraordinary access to classified databases, sensitive law enforcement intelligence, and the authority to influence who could enter or remain in the United States. These tools were meant to protect national security. Cisneros transformed them into commodities he could sell, to the highest bidder. Beginning in September 2015, Cisneros entered into an 18-month arrangement with Individual 1, a figure connected to organized crime. The compensation package was substantial, approximately $100,000 in checks and gifts over 2 years, supplemented by private aviation, upscale accommodations, gourmet dining, and various other perks that dramatically elevated his lifestyle. But the money was only part of the equation. What Individual 1 truly purchased was something far more valuable: unfettered access to the inner workings of federal law enforcement. The services Cisneros provided read like a manual on how to corrupt government systems from within. When Individual 1 needed information about a German national identified in court documents as WR, Cisneros accessed Department of Homeland Security databases and conducted unauthorized searches. He then reported back that he had removed a hit on the individual, signaling that derogatory information had been erased from the system. Whether this was true or simply a lie to justify his payment remained unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. Cisneros was manipulating federal records on behalf of criminals. He also established alerts within law enforcement databases tied to an address associated with an unauthorized marijuana cultivation operation. These alerts functioned as an early warning system, notifying Cisneros whenever other agencies showed interest in the location. He could then relay this intelligence to Individual 1, allowing the criminal organization to stay several steps ahead of legitimate investigations. Every search warrant, every surveillance operation, every investigative move became compromised the moment Cisneros learned about it. Perhaps most brazenly, Cisneros orchestrated the entry of Individual 1's brother-in-law into the United States from Mexico. He obtained an official Department of Homeland Security letter bearing the signature of an HSI, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, someone who almost certainly had no idea their authority was being exploited. This document granted parole status, allowing the foreign national to legally enter American territory. Cisneros didn't stop there. He continued monitoring the brother-in-law's asylum application, providing regular updates to Individual 1 about its progress through the immigration system. When law enforcement executed a search warrant on the residence of one of Individual 1's associates, Cisneros collected internal information about that investigation and fed it directly back to the criminal network. He had become a double agent in every sense, except the romantic espionage connotation. This was pure corruption, driven by greed and enabled by institutional access. Cisneros also committed tax fraud, underreporting his income by at least $20,000 in 2015 and an astonishing $73,000 in 2016. The unreported funds represented his illicit earnings, money he couldn't explain through legitimate channels. Federal authorities from the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation, and the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General eventually pieced together his scheme. On March 2, 2021, agents arrested Cisneros without incident at his Murrieta, California residence. His trial commenced in May 2022, lasting 5 days before a federal jury in Los Angeles. Evidence presented included financial records, database access logs, communications between Cisneros and individual 1, and testimony about his unauthorized actions. The jury deliberated and returned a devastating verdict: guilty on 30 felonies. 1 count of conspiracy to commit bribery of a public official, 1 count of bribery, 26 counts of money laundering, 2 counts of subscribing to false tax returns. United States District Judge R. Gary Klausner ordered Cisneros immediately remanded into federal custody. 6 months later, on November 21, 2022, Judge Klausner handed down the sentence: 121 months in federal prison, just over 10 years. Additionally, Cisneros faced a $30,000 fine and a forfeiture order of $133,000, representing the proceeds of his criminal enterprise. The man who once flew on private jets and stayed in luxury hotels now faced more than a decade behind bars. His betrayal had been total, his fall complete. Cisneros sold his badge to organized crime, but he wasn't the only HSI agent to weaponize his authority against innocent people. Next, we examine a special agent whose crimes were far more personal and violent. Number 4. John Jacob Olivas. The federal badge sat on the table between them, a constant reminder of the power dynamic she couldn't escape. John Jacob Olivas had made his position abundantly clear. He was above a cop, he told her, untouchable, invisible to local police due to his status as a federal agent. If she reported what he was about to do, no one would believe her, no one would respond, no one would care. And if she tried anyway, he could make her disappear, have her children taken away, or get her arrested on fabricated charges. The badge wasn't just identification, it was a weapon, and Olivas knew exactly how to wield it. Olivas joined Immigration and Customs Enforcement in 2007, eventually transitioning to Homeland Security Investigations, where he worked as a special agent. His career spanned just over 6 years in HSI before his resignation in September 2015. To the outside world, he appeared to be a dedicated federal law enforcement officer tasked with investigating transnational crimes. Behind that facade, however, lurked a predator who understood that his authority granted him not just professional power, but personal impunity. He cultivated relationships with women who had no idea they were becoming targets. January 2012 marked the beginning of documented violence. Olivas attempted to force himself on a woman after ensuring she understood the futility of resistance. He explicitly told her that police departments would not respond to any complaint she filed about him because of his federal position. He reinforced this message with threats that went beyond mere intimidation. He could erase her existence if he chose. Have her arrested on false charges, ensure her children were removed from her custody, make her vanish completely from society. These weren't empty warnings. They were credible threats delivered by someone with access to federal databases, law enforcement networks, and the institutional weight of Homeland Security behind him. 8 months later, in September 2012, Olivas targeted a different woman. This time, the violence escalated dramatically. According to trial testimony, he pointed his HSI-issued service weapon directly into her back moments before the attack. The firearm transformed an already horrifying situation into something even more terrifying: a federal agent, armed and authorized to use deadly force, now weaponizing that authority against someone completely defenseless. As with his previous victim, Olivas made certain she understood that reporting him would be pointless. He was invincible within the criminal justice system, he assured her. No investigation would proceed. No charges would be filed. He existed beyond accountability. 2 months later, in November 2012, he attacked the same woman again. The pattern had become clear. Olivas believed his badge granted him absolute immunity from consequences. Both victims endured what prosecutors would later describe as his violent, escalating, controlling, and intimidating behavior. He repeatedly brandished his HSI credentials during encounters with them, reinforcing his claim that he operated above the law. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical violence. He wanted them to feel powerless, trapped, convinced that the very system designed to protect them had been corrupted by someone wearing its uniform. For years, Olivas continued his career as if nothing had happened. But federal investigators from the FBI and ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility were quietly building a case. On August 1, 2018, a federal grand jury returned a 3-count indictment charging him with deprivation of rights under color of law. Authorities arrested him without incident later that month in Riverside, California. He entered a not guilty plea and was initially released on $50,000 bond, ordered to stand trial. The FBI issued a public appeal, encouraging anyone with information about Olivas' conduct or anyone who believed they might have been victimized to come forward. His trial commenced 4 years later and lasted 11 days. Prosecutors presented testimony from both victims, who described in excruciating detail the systematic abuse they had suffered. The evidence included accounts of Olivas' threats, his use of federal credentials as intimidation tools, and his deployment of his service weapon during one assault. In all 3 incidents charged, prosecutors argued that Olivas had violated his victims' constitutional rights to liberty and bodily integrity. Fundamental protections every American is guaranteed, protections that a federal agent is sworn to uphold rather than destroy. In December 2022, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all 3 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. United States District Judge Jesus G. Darnell immediately ordered Olivas remanded into federal custody. There would be no bond pending sentencing. The man who once claimed to be untouchable would await his fate behind bars. That fate arrived on May 8, 2023, when Judge Darnell handed down a sentence that matched the severity of the crimes: life in federal prison. The judge also ordered Olivas to pay $17,125 in restitution to his victims. At the father hearing, Judge Darnell characterized Olivas' actions as systematic torture of women, crimes so senseless they would cause his victims to live with this trauma for the rest of their lives. United States Attorney Martin Estrada emphasized the broader implications. Olivas is a predator who willfully abused his power as a federal agent to torment his victims, causing them physical, emotional, and psychological pain. Those who abuse their power as public officials must be held accountable. John Jacob Olivas now serves his life sentence in a federal correctional facility, his badge and authority stripped away permanently. His victims, meanwhile, continue healing from wounds that may never fully close. The man who once told women he was invisible to law enforcement discovered that no one, not even a federal agent, exists beyond justice. While Olivas used his badge to terrorize individuals, our next case reveals how another ICE official exploited sensitive government information for personal profit, compromising national security investigations in the process. Number 5. Henry Yao. The message arrived via WeChat, encrypted and seemingly secure. Is there any way to keep his mouth shut and deport him directly? The question came from one of Henry Yao's associates, someone concerned that a participant in their bank fraud conspiracy might expose the entire operation to authorities. Yao, a supervisory deportation officer with ICE's Manhattan field office, didn't hesitate. He had exactly the tools needed to make problems disappear: access to the most sensitive immigration and law enforcement databases in the United States government. What he did next would transform him from a trusted federal officer into a defendant facing multiple felony charges for selling government secrets. Yao joined Immigration and Customs Enforcement in 2015, working his way through the ranks over nearly a decade. By September 2021, his performance and reliability had earned him a promotion to Supervisory Deportation Officer at the ICE New York Field Office in Manhattan. The position granted him extraordinary access to password-protected law enforcement systems operated by the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies. He could search databases maintained by U.S. Customs and Immigration Services containing immigration application statuses. He could review U.S. Customs and Border Protection records showing when individuals crossed borders. He could examine criminal history files documenting arrests and convictions. He could access ICE databases tracking the detention and removal of foreign nationals. These systems represented some of the most confidential intelligence repositories in American law enforcement. Yao treated them like his personal information marketplace. Between 2017 and 2023, Yao participated in systematic schemes to disseminate confidential government information for his own personal and financial benefit. Federal investigators would eventually determine he improperly accessed and shared sensitive data concerning at least 28 individuals, friends, acquaintances, business associates, and people connected to various criminal enterprises. The breadth of his misconduct was staggering. He conducted unauthorized background checks to confirm whether associates were under investigation. He searched immigration status records for individuals he'd never officially encountered in his duties. He monitored border crossing patterns to help people avoid law enforcement scrutiny. He even tipped off an individual who was actively being investigated by the FBI in California, potentially compromising an entire federal operation. But his most egregious actions involved Tommy Lin, a former director in the New York City mayor's office who later served as senior advisor to the NYPD's Asian Advisory Council. Lin had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar bank fraud conspiracy, and when a disgruntled participant threatened to expose the scheme, Lin needed that person's silence permanently. He turned to Yao, offering $20,000 in cash. Between 2019 and 2020, Yao provided Lin with confidential information from law enforcement databases about the target, including a field operations worksheet containing extensive personal identifying details. The two communicated primarily through WeChat, discussing how to manufacture justification for an immigration arrest against someone who posed a threat to their criminal enterprise. On October 28, 2020, Yao executed the plan. He arrested the individual on immigration charges, placing them in custody and initiating deportation proceedings. After securing the person in handcuffs, Yao photographed his captive and sent the image to Lin as proof the job was complete. The man was subsequently deported from the United States, effectively eliminating him as a witness who could unravel Lin's fraud operation. Lin had purchased not just information, but the entire machinery of federal immigration enforcement, weaponized against someone for purely criminal purposes. Yao was cautious about leaving evidence. In messages to various co-conspirators, he repeatedly warned them, "Do not disseminate," and "I don't like to leave records." He understood the sensitivity of what he was doing. In one exchange with someone identified in court documents as CC2, Yao even offered advice about evading American jurisdiction. When the person expressed concern about potential legal troubles, Yao suggested fleeing to Hong Kong, writing, "It's okay because China doesn't have an extradition treaty with the US." He wasn't just leaking information, he was actively counseling people on how to escape accountability for their crimes. Federal investigators from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, and the New York City Department of Investigation spent years piecing together Yao's activities. They analyzed database access logs, recovered encrypted communications, documented financial transactions, and interviewed victims whose privacy had been violated. On November 21, 2024, authorities arrested Yao at his residence in Manhattan. He was charged with 1 count of identity theft conspiracy, carrying a maximum 15-year sentence, 4 counts of conspiracy to convert government records and disclose protected information, 1 count of conversion of government records, and 1 count of disclosure of agency records containing individually identifiable information. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams emphasized the gravity of the betrayal. Yao allegedly tipped off an individual who was being investigated by the FBI, disclosed sensitive information from immigration databases, and most egregiously, offered to use his authority as an ICE officer to arrest specific people as favors to his friends. Public service is a privilege, not a right. FBI Assistant Director James Dennehy added that Yao had disclosed confidential law enforcement information of more than 24 individuals to unauthorized recipients for personal and financial gain, eroding public trust. Yao appeared before U.S. Magistrate Judge Stuart D. Aaron, who granted him a $2 million personal recognizance bond secured by a $1 million cash deposit. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for December 23, 2024. As of this recording, his case remains pending in federal court. If convicted on all charges, Yao faces significant prison time for transforming his badge into currency and his oath into a commodity for sale to the highest bidder. Henry Yao sold access to America's most sensitive databases, but not everyone who corrupts their position does so for money. Next, we examine someone who wasn't an ICE agent at all. Number 6. Scott Thomas Deiseroth. The Chevrolet Silverado weaved across both lanes of U.S. Highway 1, tires crossing the double yellow line into oncoming traffic before lurching back toward the shoulder. Concerned motorists watched the erratic pattern repeat itself near mile marker 40 inches the Florida Keys, eventually prompting someone to dial emergency services. When Monroe County Sheriff's deputies caught up to the vehicle just after 3:30 in the afternoon on August 13, 2025, they witnessed the dangerous driving, first-hand heavy swerving, complete disregard for lane markings, a pickup truck piloted by someone clearly unfit to operate machinery. What they discovered when they finally stopped the vehicle near mile marker 36 would add layers of complexity to what initially appeared to be a straightforward impairment case. Behind the wheel sat 42-year-old Scott Thomas Deiseroth of Miami. In the back seat, 2 young boys ages 7 and 9 sat buckled into their seats, having just experienced a terrifying journey with their father. When deputies approached the driver's side window, the smell of alcohol immediately filled the air. Deiseroth appeared disoriented, unable to correctly identify his current location or provide an accurate description of which direction he'd been traveling. His speech carried the telltale signs of intoxication, his movements uncoordinated. But before deputies could proceed with standard procedures, Deiseroth made an announcement that would dominate the encounter. He was a federal agent with the Department of Homeland Security, specifically an officer with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. "I'm federal," he told the deputies. "I'm trying to get home. I got my boys with me." The claim carried weight, or at least it was intended to. Federal law enforcement credentials often command immediate respect from local authorities, an acknowledgement of jurisdiction and professional courtesy. Deiseroth seemed to believe his asserted status would shield him from the consequences of his actions. When asked to provide identification to verify his imitas federal employment, however, he was unable or unwilling to produce any documentation. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office website would later list his occupation as an ICE officer out of Miami, though the Department of Homeland Security itself would only say they were investigating the matter and couldn't immediately confirm his employment status. Body camera footage captured what happened next. Deputies requested Deiseroth step out of his vehicle so they could conduct standardized field sobriety tests. He complied reluctantly, his irritation visible. "Are you serious right now?" he asked repeatedly, as if the deputies were creating an unnecessary inconvenience rather than responding to legitimate public safety concerns. Standing on the roadside, Deiseroth struggled with the most basic exercises. When asked to walk a straight line, he wobbled dangerously, his balance compromised by whatever substances were coursing through his system. A second deputy positioned himself nearby to ensure Deiseroth didn't stumble into oncoming traffic during the test. That's when the encounter took a disturbing turn. Deiseroth noticed the second deputy, a black officer who was simply doing his job by providing safety support. "Are you Haitian?" Deiseroth asked abruptly. The question hung in the air, inappropriate and irrelevant. "That's nothing to do with my race, buddy," the deputy responded professionally. But Deiseroth persisted. "My question was, are you Haitian?" he repeated, his tone suggesting the answer somehow mattered to the situation. When another deputy interjected that it didn't matter where the officer was from, Deiseroth insisted. "It does." The exchange revealed something beyond mere intoxication, a willingness to racially profile and challenge the authority of officers based solely on their appearance, even while those same officers were exercising remarkable restraint in the face of his belligerence. The field sobriety tests continued, and Deiseroth's performance left no doubt about his condition. He failed each standardized exercise, demonstrating clear signs of impairment. Deputies placed him in handcuffs, and as they attempted to guide him into the patrol vehicle, he cursed and resisted. Dashcam footage from earlier in the incident showed just how dangerous his driving had been. A sheriff's colonel, who initially observed the vehicle, described Deiseroth as literally in the middle of the road, taking all lanes, taking all shoulders, obviously not paying attention. The colonel followed the swerving pickup for over 200 yards with emergency lights activated before Deiseroth finally stopped. Deputies arrested Deiseroth on charges of driving under the influence and 2 counts of child endangerment. The children were safely turned over to a family member, and the Florida Department of Children and Families was notified about the incident to ensure their welfare. Deiseroth was transported to jail, where he would face the legal consequences of operating a vehicle while impaired with minors in his care. ICE released a statement acknowledging the arrest and noting that the matter was under investigation, adding that every employee at ICE is held to the highest standard of conduct. However, they declined to provide further details about Deiseroth's employment status or whether he legitimately held a position with the agency. As of now, Deiseroth's criminal case remains pending in Monroe County courts. He faces serious charges that could result in significant penalties, particularly given the presence of children in the vehicle during his reckless behavior. Whether he was truly an ICE officer exploiting his authority during a traffic stop, or simply a civilian falsely claiming federal credentials to intimidate local law enforcement, remains a question that investigators continue to examine. What is certain is that on that August afternoon, 2 young boys were placed in grave danger by someone who should have protected to them, and when confronted with accountability, that person attempted to use claims of federal authority and inappropriate racial questioning to deflect responsibility. Scott Thomas Deiseroth may or may not have been an actual ICE agent, but his actions during that traffic stop revealed a troubling mindset about privilege and accountability. Next, we turn to an HSI special agent whose corruption was unquestionably real, a man who accepted bribes from someone under investigation for human trafficking. Number 7. Joohoon David Lee. The woman sat across from Special Agent Joohoon David Lee in March 2012, preparing to share her nightmare. She had been brought to the United States under false pretenses, she explained. Trafficked by a Korean businessman to serve as what investigators would later describe in court documents as a sex slave. Lee worked for Homeland Security Investigations in Los Angeles, specifically assigned to the human trafficking unit the very division tasked with rescuing people like the woman before him and bringing their exploiters to justice. He listened carefully to her account, took notes, assured her the government would investigate thoroughly. What happened next, however, had nothing to do with justice. Lee saw an opportunity, and the price tag he would eventually accept to betray his oath was shockingly low. somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000 in cash. Lee had joined Immigration and Customs Enforcement's investigative arm, earning the trust and authority that came with federal credentials. His assignment to the Human Trafficking Unit placed him at the intersection of some of the most vulnerable victims and some of the most predatory criminals operating within American borders. These cases required sensitivity, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who had already suffered unimaginable exploitation. Lee possessed none of these qualities when it mattered most. Instead, he saw the woman's testimony as leverage he could use for personal enrichment. The investigation initially proceeded along normal channels. Lee documented the woman's allegations against the Korean businessman, identified in court records only as HS. The accusations were serious. HS had allegedly orchestrated her entry into the United States, specifically to exploit her, creating a situation where she had no meaningful freedom, no ability to escape, and no recourse to authorities. These were precisely the circumstances that human trafficking laws were designed to address. But rather than building a case against HS, Lee began building a relationship with him. Lee traveled to Seoul, South Korea, at HS' expense. The businessman covered Lee's hotel accommodations and entertainment costs, treating the federal agent who was supposed to be investigating him to a lavish experience abroad. During that trip, Lee made his intentions explicit. According to court documents and his eventual plea agreement, Lee demanded $100,000 from HS in exchange for making his immigration issues go away. It was a brazen shakedown. A federal law enforcement officer openly soliciting a massive bribe from someone under investigation for one of the most heinous crimes in the criminal code. HS negotiated downward, ultimately agreeing to pay between $6,000 and $7,000 in cash. Upon returning to the United States, Lee filed his official report on the HS investigation. The document was brief and conclusive. Subject was suspected of human trafficking. No evidence found and victim statement contradicts. Case closed. No further action required. With a single paragraph, Lee dismissed the woman's testimony, declared the investigation complete, and freed HS from any further scrutiny. The woman who had courageously come forward, trusting that the American justice system would protect her, had been betrayed by the very agent assigned to help her. Her exploitation continued, sanctioned, now by a corrupted federal investigation that declared her abuser innocent. Lee's corruption didn't stop there. Separate allegations would later emerge involving his conduct in Las Vegas, where he had allegedly accepted free food and alcohol worth thousands of dollars per visit from the owner of a Korean establishment called Club Sonagi. According to a federal lawsuit filed by rival restaurant Club Yamang, Lee and the Club Sonagi owner conspired to destroy the competing business. In July 2013, Lee orchestrated a raid on Club Yamang, portraying it as a center for trafficking and other criminal activity. The raid was based almost entirely on Lee's representations and, according to the lawsuit, relied on crude stereotypes about Asian establishments. During the operation, female employees were detained and interrogated about their immigration status and whether they were involved in illicit work. One woman, Aja Kim, was taken to an ICE detention center where Lee subjected her to intense questioning and illegally placed a monitoring device on her ankle for months without warrant or court order. The raid devastated Club Yamang's reputation and business, ultimately forcing it to close. But it was the human trafficking bribery case that brought Lee's career to an end. ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility conducted an extensive investigation, piecing together Lee's trip to Seoul, the cash payments from HS, and the falsified investigative report. On December 18, 2015, Lee appeared before United States District Judge Michael W. Fitzgerald and pleaded guilty to one count of bribery. He resigned from Homeland Security Investigations 1 week later, ending a career built on authority he had systematically abused. U.S. Attorney Eileen Decker minced no words in her assessment. Corrupt officials who abuse their positions of power to line their pockets compromise our entire system of government. In this case, a federal law enforcement officer thwarted justice in exchange for just a few $1,000s and hindered the ability of a possible trafficking victim to seek justice. Joe Geronimo, special agent in charge for ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility, added that there would be zero tolerance for public officials who abuse their authority and violate the public's trust. On July 26, 2016, Judge Fitzgerald sentenced Lee to 10 months in federal prison, calling the bribery a very, very grave crime. Lee, who had relocated to Las Vegas and was working as a limousine driver, earning $21,000 annually, was ordered to surrender to authorities by September 23rd. The man who once held the power to rescue trafficking victims had sold that power for the price of a used car. By the time of his sentencing, the woman whose case he had closed without proper investigation remained without justice, her trafficker free because a federal agent valued a few $1,000s more than his duty to protect the vulnerable. Joohoon David Lee betrayed a trafficking victim for cash, but medical professionals entrusted with immigrant care have committed even darker betrayals. Next, we examine a detention facility doctor accused of performing unauthorized operations on women who couldn't consent or refuse. Number 8. Doctor Mahendra Amin. The nurse at Irwin County Detention Center had heard the whispers for months. Detained women returning from appointments with the outside gynecologist would speak in hushed, confused tones about procedures they didn't understand, operations they hadn't fully consented to, pain they hadn't anticipated. Some emerged physically changed in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. When Dawn Wooten, a licensed practical nurse at the facility in Ocilla, Georgia, finally decided to come forward in September 2020, she brought with her allegations so disturbing they would spark congressional investigations, international outcry, and comparisons to some of the darkest chapters in American medical history. At the center of it all sat Dr. Mahendra Amin, a gynecologist practicing in nearby Douglas, Georgia, whom some staff members had begun calling the uterus collector. Amin had maintained a professional relationship with the Irwin County Detention Center for years, serving as the facility's primary gynecologist for women detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. These were some of the most vulnerable patients imaginable, women far from home, navigating a foreign legal system, often speaking limited English, with no family advocates present during medical consultations. They depended entirely on the professionalism and ethical standards of medical providers assigned to their care. According to mounting evidence, Amin exploited that dependence systematically. Wooten's whistleblower complaint, filed with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, contained alarming claims. She reported that multiple detained women had told her they received significant procedures without fully understanding why. Everybody he sees has a hysterectomy. Just about everybody, Wooten stated in her complaint. I've had several inmates tell me that they've been to see the doctor and they've had hysterectomies, and they don't know why they went or why they're going. The allegation suggested a pattern of unnecessary operations performed on women who couldn't meaningfully consent or refuse treatment. The complaint triggered an 18-month investigation by the Senate Subcommittee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. What investigators ultimately uncovered painted a complex but deeply troubling picture. While the Senate did not corroborate allegations of mass removals of reproductive organs, finding only 2 such complete procedures between 2017 and 2019, which ICE deemed medically necessary, they discovered something equally disturbing. Between 2017 and 2020, Amin performed over 80% of certain types of gynecological procedures on women detained across the entire United States immigration system. The Irwin County facility held just 4% of women in ICE custody during that period. Yet, Amin was responsible for the overwhelming majority of specific interventions, including laparoscopies, limited examinations, and other invasive treatments performed nationwide on detained individuals. The Senate commissioned an independent medical review of over 16,000 pages of records pertaining to 94 women treated by Amin. Dr. Peter Chironi, an obstetrician-gynecologist tasked with evaluating the files, concluded that Amin's approach was too aggressive. The review determined that female detainees appeared to have undergone excessive, invasive, and often unnecessary gynecological procedures. Independent physicians consulted by the New York Times found that Amin consistently overstated the size or risks associated with cysts or masses attached to his patient's reproductive organs and consistently recommended surgical intervention, even when it did not seem medically necessary at the time, and non-surgical treatment options were available. Individual women began sharing their experiences publicly. Pauline Beenham reported having a fallopian tube removed without proper consent. Jeremy Floriano Navarro described being told she would undergo a simple 20-minute procedure to address a cyst, only to have a nurse later inform her the actual plan was far more extensive. The nurse who was taking me to the hospital told me that I was going to have my womb removed, Floriano Navarro recalled. I was like, what? No, that's not right. I am going to have my cyst removed. Fortunately, her procedure was postponed after she tested positive for antibodies, and she was eventually deported before it could occur. You could quote me as the one that got away, she said later. Karina Cisneros Preciado, who was 23 years old when detained, at Irwin between July 2020 and January 2021, testified before the Senate about her experience with Amin. She had been told she would receive a routine examination, but the actual procedure was entirely different and conducted without explanation or discussion of her options. All he said was, "Open your legs," she testified. As a survivor of prior assault, the experience was traumatic and dehumanizing. It made me remember what I went through and made me feel like I had no rights, like I had no control over my body. Investigators also discovered that Amin had previously been involved in questionable financial practices. In 2015, he and other doctors were subjects of a Justice Department investigation for making false claims to Medicare and Medicaid, ultimately resulting in a $525,000 civil settlement. The recent congressional letter from House Democrats expressed concern that Amin may have been performing unnecessary surgical procedures to defraud DHS and the federal government without consequences, suggesting financial incentives may have driven his aggressive treatment approach. When Senate investigators attempted to interview Amin, he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and declined to provide testimony. In a statement sent through representatives, he vigorously denied the allegations, calling himself a highly respected physician who has dedicated his adult life to treating a high-risk, underserved population in rural Georgia. He expressed confidence that a full review would demonstrate all care he provided was medically necessary and appropriate, and always done with the full informed consent of the patient. The investigations revealed systemic failures beyond just Amin's conduct. ICE had no policy requiring informed consent for procedures performed at outside facilities, instead claiming it was the sole professional obligation of the off-site provider. Between 2018 and 2020, detainees filed 659 reports describing delayed or deficient medical care at Irwin. Neither ICE nor LaSalle Corrections, the private company operating the facility, took effective corrective action despite mounting complaints. In May 2021, the Biden administration ordered ICE to stop detaining immigrants at the Irwin County facility as part of broader detention reform efforts. The building now houses individuals for the U.S. Marshals Service instead. As of late 2022, Dr. Mahendra Amin remained under criminal investigation by the FBI and other federal agencies. No charges have been filed. The women whose bodies became sites of allegedly unnecessary medical intervention continue dealing with the physical and psychological consequences of their treatment, many now scattered across different countries, some permanently unable to bear children they had hoped to raise. While Amin used medical authority to allegedly harm detained women, our next case involves someone who weaponized the rumen immigration system itself stealing the identities of the very people he prosecuted to commit fraud. Number 9. Raphael A. Sanchez. The immigrant files contained everything: names, dates of birth, social security numbers, addresses, intimate details about people at their most vulnerable. As chief legal counsel for ICE's Seattle Office of Principal Legal Advisor, Raphael A., Sanchez had unrestricted access to confidential immigration records spanning 4 states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. His job was to represent the federal government in deportation and asylum proceedings, to ensure fair application of immigration law, to act with the integrity expected of someone entrusted with such sensitive information. Instead, for 4 years, Sanchez systematically raided those files, selecting victims whose circumstances made them particularly defenseless, and constructed an elaborate fraud scheme that would ultimately steal over $190,000 while leaving his targets with ruined credit and debts they never knew existed. Sanchez had worked for immigration and customs enforcement for 17 years, climbing the professional ladder until he reached the top legal position in the Seattle Regional Office. By 2013, he was earning a 6-figure salary, $162,000 annually, with a total net worth estimated at over $700,000. He lived comfortably, enjoying financial stability that many people only dream about achieving. But Sanchez wanted more. Beginning in October 2013, he devised a scheme so audacious and so deeply unethical that even colleagues who worked with him daily would later express complete shock when his crimes came to light. The operation was methodical. Sanchez would access ICE's official computer database systems and review physical immigration files stored in his office. He selected victims carefully, people in various stages of removal proceedings, individuals who were either being deported or were otherwise excludable from the United States. These were people who would likely leave the country soon, meaning they might not discover the fraud for months or even years. Their vulnerability was the very reason Sanchez targeted them. Using his work computer, he forged identification documents in their names, creating counterfeit Social Security cards and Washington state driver's licenses. For male victims, he affixed his own photograph to the fake identification. For female victims, he used a photograph of a woman whose image had been published in news media specifically, a homicide victim whose picture he appropriated for his fraudulent documents. Armed with these forged credentials, Sanchez opened credit card accounts and bank lines of credit at major financial institutions, including American Express, Bank of America, and J.P. Morgan Chase. He listed his own residence as the victims' home addresses on all account paperwork. To make the scheme even more convincing, he created fabricated public utility bills in their names to provide the necessary proof of residence required by lenders. He opened email accounts and established online financial profiles for his victims, all controlled exclusively by him. He even employed credit monitoring services in their names, corresponding with credit bureaus as if he were the actual account holder, all to conceal his expanding fraud operation and ensure he received advance warning if anything threatened to expose him. Once the accounts were approved and active, Sanchez began the systematic theft. He made charges and withdrew payments totaling more than $190,000, funneling the money to himself or to entities he controlled. He used PayPal extensively, along with mobile payment platforms from Amazon, Square, Venmo, and Coin, to process fraudulent transactions. In numerous cases, he purchased goods online using credit cards bearing his victims' names and had the merchandise shipped directly to his home address. He created sham business entities to act as conduits for the stolen funds, including a corporation called Royal Weddings and an Amazon Marketplace account, constructing what prosecutors described as an intricate paper trail of falsified official documents and forged correspondence. The tax fraud added another layer of criminality. On his federal income tax returns for 2014, 2015, and 2016, Sanchez claimed 3 immigrants as relative dependents, fraudulently obtaining deductions he had no legitimate right to receive. These were people he was actively working to deport or exclude from the country, yet he listed them as family members on official government documents to reduce his own tax liability. The entire scheme demonstrated a level of calculation and deception that went far beyond opportunistic crime. This was systematic exploitation of people whose legal status made them unable to defend themselves. Meanwhile, many of the victims left, the United States completely unaware that substantial debts had been incurred in their names, that unpaid balances were accumulating interest, and that their credit histories were being destroyed. They faced deportation or voluntary departure, carrying with them financial time bombs they didn't know existed. Years later, some would discover they owed tens of thousands of dollars to institutions they'd never contacted, for purchases they'd never made, all because a federal attorney with a sworn duty to uphold the law had instead preyed upon them. The scheme finally unraveled in 2017, when ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility flagged suspicious activity on one of Sanchez's accounts during a routine audit. The internal investigation quickly escalated, revealing the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Federal authorities from the FBI and U.S. Postal Inspection Service joined the probe. On February 24, 2018, Sanchez appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. He resigned from ICE just days before entering his plea. His defense attorney, Cassandra Stam, described him as a good person who has made serious mistakes and noted that Sanchez had surrendered voluntarily to begin serving his sentence. A sealed psychological evaluation suggested deeper issues at play, with references during court proceedings indicating Sanchez may have been driven by self-destructive impulses. In his statement to U.S. District Judge Robert Lasnik, Sanchez expressed regret, but also acknowledged a strange relief. "The career that was my life is gone," he said. Gone, too, were debilitating headaches and other ailments that had plagued me before I confessed. On June 28, 2018, Judge Lasnik sentenced Sanchez to 48 months in federal prison and ordered him to pay $190,345 in restitution immediately. Sanchez also surrendered his license to practice law. Acting Assistant Attorney General John Cronin captured the betrayal succinctly. Raphael Sanchez was entrusted with overseeing the honest enforcement of our country's immigration laws. Instead, Sanchez abused that trust and capitalized on his position at ICE to exploit his victims and line his own pockets. The Seattle ICE office had now seen 2 attorneys criminally prosecuted within 2 years. Sanchez's predecessor in misconduct being Jonathan Love, who pleaded guilty in 2016 to forging documents affecting a Mexican national's immigration case. The pattern raised troubling questions about oversight and institutional culture, questions that advocates for immigrant rights were quick to highlight. But for Sanchez's victims, scattered across multiple countries, the damage was already done, credit destroyed, debts lingering, all at the hands of the very person who was supposed to represent justice. While Sanchez stole identities for personal enrichment, our final case examined someone who sold his position differently, accepting payments to let dangerous cargo and people slip through America's borders. Number 10. Leonard Darnell George. The inspection booth at San Ysidro Port of Entry stands as the busiest land border crossing in the entire Western Hemisphere, processing tens of thousands of vehicles daily between San Diego and Tijuana. Every officer stationed there carries immense responsibility to detect contraband, identify unauthorized crossings, and protect American national security while facilitating legitimate travel and commerce. In late 2021, Officer Leonard Darnell George worked that booth, scanning documents, asking routine questions, waving vehicles through or sending them to secondary inspection. But George had already abandoned his oath to protect. He'd made a different arrangement entirely, one that would earn him the nickname the Goalie among drug traffickers, and eventually land him in federal prison for 23 years. George joined U.S. Customs and Border Protection in 2018, after previously working for CoreCivic, the private company operating the Otay Mesa Detention Center. Within 3 years, he'd established himself at San Isidro, maintaining the appearance of a dedicated federal officer while secretly building connections that would compromise American border security in exchange for extraordinary sums of cash. The corruption began with a chance encounter. 2 travelers passing through George's inspection lane struck up a conversation about a shared interest, the Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club in Tijuana, a notorious establishment known for offering more than just entertainment. What seemed like casual small talk was actually an audition. The 2 men were members of a drug trafficking organization, and they recognized opportunity when they saw it. The traffickers cultivated George methodically, throwing him a lavish party at the very club they'd bonded over. The recruitment was complete. George agreed to use his federal position to facilitate criminal operations on a scale that would shock even seasoned investigators. The arrangement was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. When George reported for duty, he would send messages to members of the drug trafficking organization, informing them which inspection lane he was working. He gave them a 1-hour window to reach his booth. During that hour, vehicles loaded with methamphetamine, fentanyl, and unauthorized migrants would approach San Isidro. When they reached George's lane, he would perform cursory inspections and wave them through without genuine scrutiny. The system worked flawlessly until it didn't. In February 2022, law enforcement had placed an alert on a vehicle suspected of drug smuggling. When that vehicle entered George's lane, the system automatically flagged it, forcing him to send it to secondary inspection, where officers discovered approximately 222 pounds of methamphetamine. George had no choice but to comply with protocol for that one vehicle. But a second vehicle from the same trafficking organization was traveling directly behind the flagged one. Despite the massive drug seizure that had just occurred literally moments earlier, George allowed that second vehicle to pass through his lane and into the United States. It contained over 200 pounds of narcotics. Text messages recovered later would show George received approximately $13,000 for allowing that single vehicle to enter the country. The audacity didn't end there. The very next day, George used his bribe money to purchase a brand new 2020 Cadillac CT5 as a gift for one of his trafficking associates. On Valentine's Day, he personally drove the luxury sedan across the border and delivered it to the recipient in Ensenada, Mexico. The gesture cemented his status within the criminal organization. He wasn't just a corrupt officer taking payments. He was a trusted partner, invested in their success and prosperity. Over 6 months, prosecutors and law enforcement identified approximately 19 separate crossings George facilitated for criminal organizations. Text messages revealed his pricing structure: $17,000 for one vehicle, $34,000 for 2, $51,000 for 3, or $65,000 for 4. In June 2022, George received $68,000 after allowing 4 vehicles from one organization to pass through his lane in a single shift. According to plea agreements from co-defendants, the trafficking groups would send 4 or 5 vehicles loaded with contraband or unauthorized migrants through George's lane during every shift he worked. One co-defendant estimated that approximately 300 undocumented individuals entered the United States through George's lane during this period. Documents don't specify the total drug quantity that passed through, but one vehicle alone contained 223 pounds of methamphetamine and 13 pounds of fentanyl. George spent his illicit earnings with conspicuous extravagance. Witnesses testified he purchased vehicles, motorcycles, and jewelry. On his days off, he traveled to Tijuana to visit Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club, spending approximately $5,000 per trip. He would stand on the club's second level and throw cash over the balcony, literally showering the dancers below with money while buying bottles of alcohol and lavish gifts. The visual was striking: a federal officer sworn to protect American borders, standing in a foreign country, flinging corruption proceeds through the air like confetti. Prosecutors estimated George netted between $300,000 and $400,000 during his criminal enterprise. The extent of George's integration into the trafficking world became undeniable during trial when prosecutors introduced a photograph. One of George's trafficking associates had taken a selfie wearing George's official CBP uniform jacket. The image spoke volumes about how completely the boundaries between law enforcement and criminality had dissolved. George wasn't merely accepting bribes, he was sharing the symbols of his authority with the very people he was supposed to be stopping. Federal authorities from Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, and CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility conducted an extensive investigation. In June 2024, a federal jury convicted George of receiving bribes as a public official, conspiracy to import controlled substances, and 2 counts of bringing certain individuals into the country for financial gain. His co-defendants, facing their own charges, had pleaded guilty before trial. George's defense attorney, Antonio Yoon, argued that witnesses who'd accepted plea deals couldn't be trusted and had motivation to testify against George to secure lighter sentences. The jury disagreed. On October 25, 2024, U.S. District Judge Todd Robinson sentenced George to 280 months, 23 years, in federal prison. U.S. Attorney Tara McGrath emphasized the significance. What's important to remember about the story of Leonard George is that his corruption was discovered and defeated. Our commitment to the integrity of the badge brought justice to a corrupt officer in this case who will spend decades behind bars. FBI San Diego Special Agent in Charge Stacy Moy added that the entire law enforcement profession is tarnished when an officer betrays the oath to protect and serve. Leonard Darnell George will spend more than 2 decades behind bars, his career destroyed, his reputation obliterated, his freedom forfeited. Meanwhile, the drugs he allowed through his lane contributed to the ongoing crisis devastating American communities. The migrants he waved through entered without proper vetting or documentation. And the trust that citizens place in the uniform he wore was damaged by every vehicle he corruptly processed. The goalie had been stopped, but the damage he inflicted during those 6 months at America's busiest border crossing will echo for years to come. These 10 cases represent a spectrum of corruption within immigration enforcement, from serial murder to medical abuse, from identity theft to drug trafficking facilitation. Each betrayed the public trust in different ways, but all demonstrated that a badge and authority, when corrupted, can cause extraordinary harm to the most vulnerable people in society.